And we are now recording as well. So hello to those of you who are joining us. I'm really excited about this panel about COVID-19 in correctional settings. I am your stream host, Dr. Boppre. I am an assistant professor at Wichita State University in Kansas, and I'm also a board member of CrimCon, all of 5 of us. So we're really excited to host this first virtual conference for you all. Just some things to keep in mind. We'll be proceeding in the order of the program. Each presenter will have 10 minutes, and that is 10 minutes on the dot. And when you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. My colleague Joan was hosting this stream earlier, and it sounded like the Q&A may not have been working. So you can try the chat or Q&A, whatever works. We're in uncharted territory, so we'll just figure out what works best. And then this is what it should look like if you're an attendee. So on your end, you should see this. And just remember to have fun. So the reason why we wanted to start CrimCon was to do something different and something new and more accessible to people who may not be able to attend conferences like ASC. And so I hope you enjoy yourselves. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. And so I'm also timing myself, so that will be fun. All right, so thank you all for coming to our presentation. I'm presenting ongoing research with my colleague, Dr. Meghan Novisky from Cleveland State University. Again, I'm Dr. Boppre, and I am from Wichita State University. And so we'll be presenting preliminary results from this ongoing study. And so as many of you know on this panel, we are dealing with a global pandemic. The consequences of that are increased among incarcerated populations. So the infection rate for COVID-19 in US jails and prisons is 5.5 times higher than in the general population. And the death rate is also 3.3 times higher in incarcerated populations. And so part of that is when we think about the settings in these prisons and jails, first and foremost, social distancing is nearly impossible. Many prisons across the US have dorm-like settings where it's open and looks like the image here. There also may be shared cells that are in total 6 feet wide. And so distancing more than 6 feet with the person that you share a cell with is basically impossible. And so also there's issues related to having access to adequate cleaning supplies, including hand sanitizer is considered contraband in many institutions across the US. And so a lot of the things that we know could potentially prevent the spread of the disease, incarcerated people have limited access to or no access to at all. And another layer of this is that symbolically prisons are located out of sight, out of mind. They're located outside of our communities. Often what occurs inside prison is not known to the general public. So there's largely been a lack of transparency in how correctional agencies are approaching the pandemic. And because of that, we know broadly the rate and in individual prisons, but there's a lot that we still don't know. And that's largely why Meghan and I think it was late March, we were seeing things on Twitter, we were seeing things in news reports that frankly we were disturbed about, and we really wanted to understand from the perspectives of those directly impacted what exactly is going on. And so the impacts of the pandemic extend to the communities. These prisons might be located remotely, but the impacts, especially for jails, can increase the spread of the virus within their own communities. And beyond the communities, it's also impacting family members. So 1 in 2 adults across the US has had an immediate family member incarcerated. This was from a recent nationally representative survey. And so what we're finding from media reports and things that we've seen online is that largely families are being kept in the dark about how correctional agencies are handling the pandemic. One news report from Indiana said that a family didn't know their loved one had COVID until they had already passed away. And so because, again, these reports that were coming out being shared in social media, Meghan and I really wanted to figure out why this is happening and what is actually going on in these facilities, and also the impact that it's having on family members. And so that's really the focus of our study, is the impacts of familial incarceration during the pandemic. And we're looking at it from the perspectives of families who are directly impacted. And so I'll talk briefly about the methods. So 316 people across the US with at least one loved one incarcerated participated in an online survey via Qualtrics. And so these individuals represent a convenient sample. They were from social media is how we largely contacted them, but also through support groups for families of incarcerated people. And so part of gaining access to these support groups was that I myself have had family members incarcerated, and so it allowed me to gain access to those support groups through Facebook. And so this is where we see our sample composition come from across the US. Again, it's convenient sampling. So I'm from Nevada, so I assume that's part of why more people participated from the state of Nevada. Meghan lives in Ohio, so again, we see more individuals from Ohio. I currently live in Kansas, so we saw pockets, right, of people who are participating based upon, where we, the researchers, are from. And again, this creates a convenience sample that's not necessarily representative. But as we're coming at this from a phenomenological approach using mixed methods, that's okay for the purpose of our study. We really just want to understand a description of what's happening from the perspectives of families. And so the bigger part of this study is follow-up interviews with 35 family members who completed the survey. And so these interviews have lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to 2.5 hours. So spending a lot of time talking in depth with families about the impacts of incarceration right now during the pandemic. And so our plan is also to conduct follow-up interviews with these 35 family members because things have likely changed since we interviewed them over the summer. Visitation has opened up in some jurisdictions. And so our next step is conducting more interviews. Right now we're transcribing the qualitative interviews. So I'm going to discuss some of the findings from the survey and pepper in some quotes from the qualitative interviews. And so I'll go through this pretty quickly. So first I'll talk about protection and testing. So of our sample, the majority reported that their incarcerated loved ones were not tested for COVID-19. So 74% indicated that they were not tested. Of those who were tested, the 21%, 6% were positive cases and 11% were unsure of the outcome. Also, many incarcerated loved ones were not provided personal protective equipment. And so your reaction might be like mine, like, okay, we know from CDC guidelines that the personal protective equipment is what prevents the spread. And what we found from our interviews in particular is that there's discrepancies in access to masks. So for example, in Nevada, incarcerated people were not allowed to wear masks at all until late June. And so again, that directly contradicts what we know the guidelines are from the CDC. And we also asked family members about the emotional impacts. So the majority of our sample indicated that adverse symptoms had increased. So symptoms of loneliness, depression, sadness. The majority indicated that their anxiety had increased due to the pandemic, their stress, and most of all, their worry. And so just to give you an example of what is causing this worry, One participant said, "It's hard for me to be strong for him when I'm worried at the same time. You never truly know if they're okay in there." Also, we asked about loved ones' satisfaction with how correctional facilities are handling the pandemic. So the majority of family members were not satisfied. So only 2% were very satisfied, 3% were satisfied, 10% were neutral, 27% were unsatisfied, and the vast majority were very unsatisfied. And a lot of this level of satisfaction was directly related to how correctional agencies were handling the pandemic and also communicating with loved ones on the outside. So one participant said, "My biggest worry is that he won't make it out alive. I'm afraid he will get COVID-19 and the one doctor staffed at the prison won't be able to treat him." There were also decreases in communication, and a lot of this was due to lockdowns. So lockdowns even decreased the ability for loved ones to call their family members on the outside through the phone. And so many indicated decreased communication with their loved one. It's Lady Gaga, one of my favorites. So really, even if they had access to the phones, they were not able to call as frequently as they were before the pandemic, because now we have a rush of people trying to get to the phones all at the same time during a very limited time frame because of lockdowns. And so one participant said, "Not being able to see him or hear his voice regularly makes him feel even farther away." And so the narratives are really highlighting the impact that this decreased communication has on loved ones. And so the majority of family members disagreed that agencies provide effective communication to them about policies and procedures. And so that was a major form of dissatisfaction as well. So the key takeaways: there's been limited prevention measures, limited transparency and communication. There's been heightened mental health symptoms and dissatisfaction with correctional responses. So next steps: transcription and analyses. That's what we're working on now, as well as follow-up interviews that are going to occur over the next month or so, and then publish results. So that's where we're going from here. And I thank you all for joining today. Here is our contact information. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And our next person can share now.
Okay. Am I live now?
You are live. It's in like the PowerPoint view though.
Oh, okay. Let's fix that. Oh, and is it still in the PowerPoint view?
Yeah, it's kind of like the notes view.
I don't know what that does. Oh,
that might be it. Yeah. Now it looks good.
That one. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. Well, thanks for all who are here. I'm going to be presenting on implementation of FaceTime as a family visitation opportunity in the face of COVID-19. And also on the panel are my research colleagues, Rebecca Pfeffer from RTI and Beatriz Amalfi from Sam Houston State University. She's a graduate student there and played a very big role in collecting all of this data for the project. So let me just describe the project. It was funded by the Simmons Foundation. You can see a picture in the left-hand screen of the actual site. Lovely facility in Texas that we had identified, where we had approached the facility about exploring the use of video visitation as a way to augment family contact. So the idea was that we could introduce technology, namely a weekly 15-minute video chat, and that would, again, augment what they had in place, which was a weekly 7-minute phone call and once a week visitation. So the project site was a 120-bed residential treatment program. It was a substance abuse treatment program for female probationers. So our target population was women. The program was 4 to 6 months, and it was a secure facility. So the women had one furlough through the whole time they were there, so very little contact other than through the visitation and phone calls. And you can see from the picture, we used iPads to facilitate either FaceTime or Skype calls. The study time frame, it began in February 19 and ended just here in July 2020. As we're all very familiar with, March 2020 really marked where a lot of the lockdown happened related to COVID. And that is also the time when the facility discontinued or suspended any kind of face-to-face visitation. Now, our intent in this project was not to examine COVID. Our intent was to really examine the use of increased contact on both facility engagement or program engagement, as well as on reentry. However, COVID presented an opportunity to really examine how women used the video chat technology, how they used their time, and what their kind of experience was with video chat in the face of COVID-19. So we did a mixed method study, and we disaggregated data looking at pre-COVID, which was a year's worth of data, February 19 to 20, and then looked from March 2020 to July 20 at, again, how women experienced the use of the video chat after COVID. And the ends there don't represent the women, they represent the contacts. So that's the number of contacts we had during that time frame. So as a mixed method, we looked at, for the quantitative data, we looked at a post-visitation survey. So at the conclusion of every weekly call, the women were asked to complete a one-page survey that just gathered information about how they used the call, what they spent their time kind of doing, and then a few questions on their experience with the call. And then we also conducted a focus group, one in the pre-COVID period and then one after COVID had hit, just to get more information on how the women's experience with the video chat went. For the purpose of this paper, our question is, do use and perceptions of the video visitation change during confinement with COVID-19? So I'm going right into the data. We collected a lot of different data. So one of the questions was, who exactly did the women contact? They weren't restricted. We allowed them to contact anyone they viewed as a support in the community. So you can see the blue bar represents pre-COVID period, the orange bar post-COVID. And this is just descriptive data talking about who they were contacting. During the pre-COVID period, they were most likely to contact children as well as parents. Post-COVID, that changed a bit from spouse or significant other and children as well. One thing we found interesting, we did some significance testing, chi-square test, to look at differences pre and post. And we found that there was a significant decrease in contacting parents post-COVID-19, which is a little counterintuitive to me, given how the disease works. But that's one thing we found. We also found that they did contact at a higher rate non-relatives, so friends, folks that they were likely checking on in the community. The program itself offers a lot of cognitive behavioral programming. So there's substance abuse, criminal thinking. We actually also train the women on a program designed to help improve family relationships specifically. And so we wanted to know whether or not they were able to take the skills they're learning in programming and actually use those during these calls as a way to, again, kind of help prepare them for the relationships when they leave. So we coded, had them identify if there were any specific skills they were able to use during those calls. And as you can see here, a high rate of use of skills. So often they identified they were able to incorporate skills. And most frequent were communication skills, as well as just general relationship building skills. What's interesting to me is that in looking at the pre and post COVID information, across the board, once we look at the specific, disaggregate by specific skills, every skill had a significantly lower likelihood of being identified as being used during those video chats. So they were less likely to be using these skills during the video chats. And it may be, we had some discussion about this, just that the fact that the stressor of the disease was at the forefront and not as much their recovery and how they can use the skills to aid in that recovery. You can see here also that there is a quote that we pulled from our qualitative data that really just talks about how they were able to incorporate, in this example, new ways of thinking into the calls that they had with families, so that it was an opportunity, instead of just learning these skills in group, to actually in vivo practice them in the video chat sessions. The other thing we had the women identify was emotions. So we wanted to know, following the video chat calls, how did that call leave them feeling? There was some discussion earlier on with the clinical director whether or not this would really create negative or positive emotions and experiences for the women, given that it may actually cause them to miss and be sad about not being with their family at a higher rate. So here, they coded how they felt after the call, and we had a lot of, overwhelmingly, they were experiencing positive emotions. Highest frequent was happy, feeling supported, feeling motivated, feeling connected. In terms of differences pre and post, we found that there was significantly reduced identification of being happy and being supported in the post-COVID period. So others were not significantly different, but you see generally that there's a slight shift down in the identification of positive emotions during post-COVID. Again, this is a quote from our qualitative data that really just is a woman that talks about not having seen her son in 6 months and the positive emotions that came from being able to actually see him on the video chat for the first time. So this is the other end. We have them code both positive and negative emotions, and you can kind of see both are the same scale, that overwhelmingly they're recording positive feelings immediately following those video chats. But there were some negative emotions well, anxiety or being anxious was the highest. But again, much lower rate than the positive emotions. Where we did see significant differences, although you see they're small, but they were significant, is they were reported a significantly less likely to report feeling depressed or angry or tearful following the calls, again, in the post-COVID timeframe. So while they weren't reporting increased happy feelings, they're also not reporting increased kind of negative emotions following the video chats. Here is a quote from a woman that talks some about the fact that these calls don't always end positively, right? She talks about leaving the calls sometimes being in a quote unquote non-happy mood. But she also talks in the end about how those types of calls do not overshadow the positive elements of the calls, and the fact that they get a lot of positives out of having access to the video chats. This is a final question that we ask in the survey that just looks at the reentry question. So the question is, and they're scoring it on a Likert scale, did this video chat, was it helpful in preparing me for going back to my family and community? And you can see here that the vast majority, whether pre or post, marked that they strongly agreed that, that this was helpful in returning to the community. And here a woman talks about her stepmom and getting along with her stepmom. And again, she really talks about being able to use conflict resolution to discuss issues with her family, and that really helping in transitioning back to the community. So some of the emergent themes are that women that engaged in the program really said that it did help their commitment. It helped motivate them to engage in the program. They felt more connected, not only to family, but also to other women. They talked about, primping for the calls, getting ready for the calls, processing the calls afterwards. So they help with not only connection outside, but also inside the facility. They also talked about the calls benefiting their friends on the other end and their family, their children, seeing them in recovery seemed beneficial to family as well. We talked about practicing skills. Interestingly, we were concerned that access to technology on the family end would be an issue, and did not find that at all. Very few women were unable to participate because they didn't have family with a smartphone or computer. Okay, and I think I'm really close to being out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the COVID-19 specifically. The women reported, had they not had COVID, had they not had access to video technology, which again was by happenstance in this program, when COVID-19 hit, they felt that the program really would have been difficult for them. They also reported that they felt that they had a more realistic sense of what was happening in the community, because they weren't just hearing it by the news. They were able to see and interact with family more often. Last, and I'll just touch on policy implications. Having more resources for families to connect when they're confined is really important, not just women, but men as well. And, televisitation is a really cost-effective source. The only caveat would be that it should not, and we heard this from the women, be viewed as a replacement for face-to-face visitation, rather a way to increase at a low cost their ability to interact with family. And then finally, again, it was very lucky for the program that we had introduced this pilot video chat because, you know, the unexpected pack popped up and they were prepared to be able to use the video technology when they could not see their families. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I will not use PowerPoint. Let's keep ball rolling. In the first place, I'd like to say that I'm really happy to be here talking with all of you and exposing some thoughts about how I think COVID-19 will reinforce the non-inclusive nature of the contemporary prison, and especially how I believe that we can challenge it. Secondly, as you can see, my English is far from being perfect, but I try to be clear as much as I can. The 70s are commonly present as the beginning of a process in which rehabilitation is gradually eclipsed by other objectives, such as punishment by itself, neutralization, or even risk management. Generally, the explanation of this process has been focused on prison and its proximities. I mean, some problems have been pointed out, like the lack of resources, both human and material, the expansive nature of the contemporary criminal law, or the configuration of prison as a total institution. However, I strongly believe that these explanations are not enough to understand the true nature of the problem because they do not take into consideration the kind of social structure in which contemporary prison is currently working. Unlike those interpretations, my point is that the rehabilitation crisis is closely related to a non-inclusive society where the main element of social inclusion, this is work, is more and more restricted. After all, we can try to reintegrate people, but the main question is if this is possible in a society in which the condition of citizenship is seriously deteriorated, and as a consequence, many people have become simply superfluous or find themselves in a really precarious situation. For me, the answer is clear, and this is not possible, and in some way explain why rehabilitation is displaced nowadays, and especially why prison is currently working as a dispositive to manage social exclusion. While on the one hand, this institution is really useful to make social problems invisible, on the other hand, it also displays symbolic effects which contribute to falsely reduce social insecurity. So let me be clear about this. If prison was born as an institution to reproduce the workforce, now it will be working as a dispositive to manage the social consequence which stem from a world where work is more and more restricted. If we take this point into consideration, it's easy to imagine that, bearing in mind the economic effects of COVID-19, the situation will be even worse during the next few years. But what can we do to challenge the non-inclusive nature of the contemporary penology? As far as I'm concerned, the most important thing that we have to do is to achieve a non-inclusive society, and for that purpose, I strongly believe that universal basic income is an excellent idea. However, it's important to clarify that the universal basic income, which I'm defending here, is totally compatible with the welfare state, being only conceived as a floor which is aimed to guarantee the right to existence. But how can this instrument be used to face the non-inclusive society and to transform the contemporary penalty? I will expose my thoughts about these questions through three different theses. First, the universal basic income has the potential to solve the contradiction between work and citizenship, which, from my point of view, mainly sustain the non-inclusive society. In this way, social inclusion wouldn't longer be related to the fact of having an employment that for many has become a real chimera. Otherwise, it will be linked to the condition of a person and the consequent right to existence. This change, I think, that could have two main consequences on the penal field. On the one hand, social exclusion could be seriously reduced, which allows to revert a big part of material conditions in which the criminalization process are based. In other words, it wouldn't be longer necessary that a significant part of the population was made invisible control, and expel. On the other hand, for people who are now in prison or in other institutions, they could be reintegrated in the society without the need to find an employment, which is more and more restricted. Therefore, the universal basic income not only allows to face the expansive nature of a criminal law which criminalizes poverty, but also to bring back the penal logics based on inclusion. Second, the universal basic income can also work as an instrument to face the symbolic effects which modern penalty develops. Currently, penal institutions are used by the states to express the power that they don't have or they don't want to use more properly in other fields like economy. For that reason, they need to create some threats in which citizens can unleash their frustration. In this way, it's really important to underline that the true source of this frustration is located on the effects of an economy which impose market over citizenship and not in crime and security. After all, under the dogma of scarcity, the neoliberal project will be proposing a sort of war between the poorest, and what happened in prison is used to spread this conflict. At this point, the second potentiality of the universal basic income could be exactly placed. By breaking the association between work and citizenship, it will be expected that this instrument could seriously reduce the levels of social insecurity, which is the first step to tackle the symbolic functions of the contemporary penalty. The more safety the citizens are, the less they need other objects to express this frustration. And finally, the universal basic income allows to think beyond prison and the current meaning of the rehabilitation aim. Not only does this instrument allow us to build a less bad prison, but also to revolution the contemporary penalty. In this way, it's crucial to underline that the origins of prisons are inseparable from a context in which wage labor plays a central role. However, one of the most interesting advantages of the universal basic income is its capacity to challenge this position. In this context, the current meaning of the rehabilitation aim will be seriously transformed, opening the possibility of breaking the symbiosis established between rehabilitation and work ethic. Therefore, this concept wouldn't longer be related to the promotion of social relationships based on verticality or wage labor as the only possible way of life. Quite the opposite, rehabilitation could be linked to the promotion of civic values, placing the basis to develop a free citizenship. In addition, the universal basic income could challenge the hegemonic position that prison occupies in current times. In the same ways that it allows to think about a life beyond work, it also makes possible to think about a penal system in which prison doesn't colonize everything and other alternatives could be seriously promoted. So that was all. Thank you very much for your attention. It was a pleasure, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're so happy to have you too. Brenda, you are up next.
Okay, great. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm here today to talk about the litigation that's been ongoing this year, challenging cruel and unusual conditions of confinement during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you all know from Bree's earlier presentation, the conditions in prison are horrific. They're experiencing a very high rate of COVID-19 spread, and there are large clusters of COVID-19 infections in prisons. This danger of spread is primarily due to the inability to social distance, inadequate ventilation in these aging structures, inadequate cleaning supplies, not having enough soap. Oftentimes inmates are required to pay for soap, and they're prohibited from having access to things like hand sanitizer, and inadequate PPE such as masks, not being provided masks, guards not wearing masks, etc. And unfortunately, there's a substantial number of incarcerated individuals who are in the high risk category for severe illness, according to CDC guidelines. We have a substantial number of incarcerated persons who are elderly or have underlying health conditions, and them being in these crowded conditions with inadequate supplies is leading to these clusters of COVID-19 infections. So incarcerated people have tried to challenge these conditions of confinement, bringing 8th Amendment challenge litigation. And the standard under which these are judged is from a case called Farmer v. Brennan, where the incarcerated person needs to prove that an action or failure to act means that the correctional officials were acting with deliberate indifference to a substantial risk of serious harm. So on the action or failure to act, what we're looking at here is a lack of a reasonable response. So failure to take reasonable steps, such as following CDC guidelines to mitigate the risk. For the deliberate indifference prong of this test, we're looking at basically recklessness. Did the correctional officials know about and disregard an excessive risk? This is a subjective standard, not should they have known, but did they know? However, courts often will infer that knowledge based on the facts. For example, if there is a very large percentage of cases in the prison population, then the correctional officials are going to maybe assumed to have inferred that risk. The last prong, the substantial risk of serious harm, is an objective factor. And let's talk more about that for a moment here. So one of the things that they're going to look at is how infectious is the disease. If you're talking about challenge based on infectious disease spread, we're going to look at the level of infectiousness that will impact the likelihood that the risk might come to fruition. And they're also going to look at the infection rate in the facility to determine whether there's reason to infer there is an excessive risk, going to that deliberate indifference factor. And on the reasonableness of the response, courts often are going to look at whether or not they're following CDC guidelines. So when the courts have applied this Farmer deliberate indifference standard to these challenges to conditions of confinement during the pandemic, there have been mixed outcomes. So courts sometimes will grant injunctive relief requiring mitigation measures, but often what you're finding is that those injunctions might be overturned on appeal, even when they're granted, or courts don't grant the injunction to begin with. One thing that's coming up in the case law a lot is that inability to social distance alone may not constitute a violation of the 8th Amendment as long as they're taking other mitigation measures, such as screening visitors and staff, providing soap and cleaners, isolating people who are sick, etc. So virtually no prison has the ability to offer the kind of social distancing you would want during a pandemic, and especially for people in the high-risk categories, such as elderly prisoners. However, that alone is generally not going to be found to violate the 8th Amendment if they're taking other measures. Another issue is that if they're taking any kind of reasonable measures to mitigate, that's not going to be considered deliberate indifference, even if this is not effective. It's not whether the measures have been effective in getting the spread down to a certain level, it's just whether they're trying, whether they're taking these measures. A substantial obstacle to this litigation is the Prison Litigation Reform Act, which requires inmates to first exhaust all available administrative remedies by using the prison administrative remedy system. And this has been a procedural hurdle to timely pursuit of conditions of confinement challenges. So I want to take a minute to talk about an example of exactly how difficult these conditions are and how the Prison Litigation Reform Act is an obstacle to incarcerated individuals getting redress. So Valentine v. Collier is a case that's been ongoing and just got to Supreme Court again a couple days ago. So it's timely, but I'll start with the facts here. This is about the Wallace Pack Unit in Texas, which is a geriatric prison. And it's a dormitory style setup so that social distancing is not possible. And its population are mostly 65 years and older. Many of them have underlying health conditions. And the spread of COVID in this prison has just been horrific. More than 40% of the population has tested positive in this geriatric prison. So these incarcerated individuals have been trying to challenge these conditions of confinement for many months without success. In April, the first COVID infection occurred in this prison, and it spread like wildfire throughout the facility. In July, they were able to get this to trial as a class action of incarcerated individuals. And after a lengthy trial, the trial court found that the prison was not taking adequate measures. They found that guards were routinely violating the rules about being masked. They weren't wearing masks consistently, that there was inadequate cleaning, really horrific facts, that prisoners that were often disabled and not really able to clean were expected to do their own cleaning. They weren't giving adequate training or supplies, and just really horrific facts going on in this prison as far as how little the prison was doing to address this. So in September, that trial court issued an injunction requiring safety measures. Many of these safety measures are things that the prison should have already been doing according to state policies, but just were not doing. And that those measures included things like cleaning surfaces, common surfaces, providing soap, making staff wear masks, weekly testing, contact tracing, and quarantining people while they're waiting to test results. So then in October, though, unfortunately, that case was appealed, and the Fifth Circuit Appellate Court stayed the injunction pending appeal, which means that the prison doesn't have to do all those safety measures. They're saying we're putting a pause on that injunction, on that order, until the appeal is heard, because the Fifth Circuit thinks that the prison is likely to win when they have the appeal, primarily because the incarcerated individuals did not use the prison's grievance process before suing. And they're interpreting this as being that every member of this class action would have had to use the internal process, which is just unrealistic, and it's going to slow things far too much for this to be an effective remedy. In November, this came to the Supreme Court, where the incarcerated individuals were asking the Supreme Court to vacate the stay of the injunction so that the prison would have to go ahead and do those measures. And the U.S. Supreme Court denied the application to vacate the stay. Now, Justice Sotomayor's dissent was illuminating. I encourage you all to read it because it really sheds a light on what's going on in this particular prison. And this is not unusual. It's going on in other prisons as well. But she denied from this denial of the application to vacate the stay, and argued that the administrative remedies really aren't available. The administrative remedy available to these prisoners was a process that would take more than 160 days under the rules they have for the prison. And they weren't giving any kind of special emergency track to COVID-related grievances. So she said there was no real possibility of relief, and therefore they should not be required to exhaust the administrative remedies under the PLRA because they weren't actually available. Obviously, that view did not win the day in the Supreme Court. However, this really shines a light on the problems with the PLRA. And the policy recommendation I'm making today is that it's time to reform the Prison Litigation Reform Act to, at a minimum, provide an exception to the requirement to exhaust administrative remedies when there's a class action seeking relief for failure to adequately address an imminent life-threatening risk, such as a public health situation with an infectious disease. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Awesome. So we have a few questions in the chat that I will read through. So I think the first question is for Meghan and I. It came up right after we presented. So the question is, who paid for the masks? Did residents or have to use commissary, or did the institution purchase the masks? The answer to that is, from our understanding, at the time when we interviewed loved ones, the institutions were paying for them, but they were limited. So like in some instances, we were told their loved ones may only have one mask for who knows how long, and they couldn't get another one. Some of them mentioned like their masks were hanging on by a string, like because they've worn them for days and days. And so just like other things, the state may give them basic necessities, but it's very limited. And maybe if they needed more, they would have to pay commissary, but I'm not sure. And I texted Meghan that that's something we should ask in our follow-up. So the next question is to Lori and colleagues. The team didn't know a pandemic that would make us rely on technology so much would hit. How did the whole team feel once COVID-19 happened? Also, how do you think the results would have been like if the pandemic didn't happen?
I'll give it a shot and start answering, please, Dr. Pfeffer, jump in, whatever. It was interesting because I think we were much more concerned than the women in the program. They were extremely happy that they had that opportunity to still connect with family members and loved ones, because at the point that COVID hit, they got rid of visitations following the CDC guidelines, so they did not have that opportunity to interact with family members at that point. So the phone and the video visitations that we implemented in that facility were the only way that they could communicate with the outside world. It was really interesting because we had many concerns. The number of women in the facility decreased by a lot. So it's a 120 bed program. And at one point, I think we had 20 women in there because as per the guidelines by the federal and the state government, they were being released as soon as they could, of course, based on good behavior and the progress that they were making in the program. So we were really concerned about the data that we would get and the information that we would get from those women, since we moved from 120 women participating in video calls every week to 10 or 20 women actually contacting their families. And another important thing that we had to do is I was in the facility every week facilitating those video calls. So at the time that COVID hit, I was not allowed, or either of us were allowed to be in the facility. So we had to train a staff member to facilitate the calls and make sure that they were following all the protocols so our data collection wouldn't be impacted. There would be no mistakes in that process.
I just want to add an important element of this was that because this whole study was grant funded, there was no cost to the participants to use the visitation. And I think that's really important, particularly given all of the financial implications associated with COVID-19. So there was no increased need for costs on the part of the participants or their families.
That's really cool that the grant paid for it, because based on our interviews, like that is definitely a concern, like the cost. Somebody asked, for any panelists, what can we do as citizens or educators to help advocate for or improve conditions for people and their families who are currently incarcerated? So I can talk a little bit about that, especially from the family perspective. I work with groups or support groups that help family members of incarcerated people. I also work with them, on disseminating research and connecting policymakers with the research in this area. So beyond, our academic publications, Meghan and I have published several op-eds with direct policy recommendations for stakeholders. And also I encourage people as well as myself to reach out to the governor in the state to express any concerns that you have about how correctional agencies are handling things. Those are my tips. I'm open if any other panelists have advice as well.
One little thing that I would add, and it's actually not so little, but I think that part of it is just humanizing those who are incarcerated. I think we need to do a better job to say these are actually real people who aren't that different from you and I. And so I've even been cognizant of my language and try to get away from terms like offenders and inmates and talk more about justice involved individuals, because I think that helps to send a message that what happens to them, whether it's behind bars or in a program or in the community, is important.
Definitely. I would echo that as well, for sure. Dana, do you have your analyses raised any research questions that you wish you could ask incarcerated persons? Definitely. So our panel here is wrapping up. I don't want to take too much time, but we should follow up. And there's definitely a lot that I wish we could have asked. And I'm sure Meghan has insight as well, because we were asking families about what was going on with their loved one incarcerated. It would be great to ask them directly. But the reason why we went with families was a big part of it was accessibility. Like we wanted to ask people who were impacted in that moment, in the height of the pandemic. And we knew that accessing incarcerated people, going through not only the hoops of our own IRB, but the hoops of the correctional facilities to gain access to those individuals would have been very difficult in a short amount of time. So definitely we should connect, and yeah, I can tell you more. Ashley asks, this question is for Dr. Rowe. Do you have any sense of who or what are bringing these cases to court? Are they primarily by incarcerated individuals? There's family, advocacy, and legal groups. Also, has there been any successful litigation against prisons? And are there any common themes in these cases?
So they're brought by incarcerated individuals because that's who would have standing to challenge the conditions. Often they're brought as class actions where a few incarcerated people are bringing it on behalf of all similarly situated incarcerated people. So for example, everyone at that prison. And unfortunately, because this is civil litigation, they have to either hire a lawyer or find lawyers that are willing to work for free, what we call pro bono law. So they're not appointed a lawyer like they would be in a criminal case where they were a defendant. So often this litigation is brought by groups of lawyers, civil rights lawyers, such as the ACLU, who are interested in trying to help these incarcerated individuals improve their conditions of confinement. I think the next part was, successes. I mean, it's been really mixed and overall not very successful. There's certainly been some successes, especially at the trial court level in certain situations, but the general pattern we're seeing is that it's very easy for the correctional officials to win these legal battles, either because they did not exhaust administrative remedies, so that procedural hurdle, or because they've taken some minimal type steps. And even though it's not really stemming the tide of spread within the prison, the courts often find that to be enough. And even though they can't do all the guidelines, such as social distancing, if they've made some kind of half-hearted good faith effort, that seems to be enough. So we aren't seeing any major successes, and certainly nothing like no big landmark case that's happened at the circuit court level or the Supreme Court level in the favor of those incarcerated individuals. It remains to be seen as the litigation unfolds, whether that will come to fruition at some point.
I would recommend, if you have any additional questions for panelists, to reach out to them directly. I'm actually about to get kicked off of here because we are over time. So I encourage you to reach out to panelists. Thank you all so much. This was an excellent panel, and I look forward to hearing more about your research. If you want to stay on for the next panel, if you're an attendee, you'll have to sign on again through the link through CrimCon. And thank you, everybody. It's good to see you.
Hi, thank you.
Bye, thanks.